My career has largely been focused on analyzing markets and companies, identifying what separates long-term success from failure. But a dynamic is currently unfolding in Washington that strikes me as deeply familiar from my corporate experience, a pattern that rarely concludes well. I feel it's necessary to discuss, not to impose a political view, but because the fundamentals of effective and ineffective leadership are, quite frankly, universal. It doesn't matter if you're running a corporation or a country. I'll begin with a premise I've held for my entire life. Loyalty is a tremendous asset, provided it is reciprocal. The most enduring partnerships I've had in business were founded on shared values and mutual respect. My decades-long partnership with Charlie Munger was possible only because our trust in one another was absolute. It was a two-way street. Neither of us worried about being sacrificed by the other when difficulties arose. We had our disagreements, certainly, but our faith in each other's fundamental integrity was never in doubt. However, when loyalty becomes a one-way obligation, it ceases to be a partnership. It degrades into something else more akin to a capture, where one side demands everything and the other side gives it, with no reciprocal guarantee. The situation I'm observing in Washington today looks distressingly similar to that latter model. It's concerning to me because I have personally witnessed this exact dynamic lead to the ruin of companies, the end of careers, and the disintegration of institutions that took generations to build. Mike Johnson, the former House Speaker, is internalizing a painful lesson that many in business have learned before him. Temporary alignment must never be confused with a durable partnership. Johnson invested his total political capital in Donald Trump, absorbing every legal scandal, public controversy, and political storm out now. Some may look at that display and see admirable conviction. But when I view it through the lens of decades spent analyzing organizations, I see something else entirely. I see the equivalent of taking one's entire retirement savings and placing it on a single, speculative tech venture that has yet to prove its model. It's possible it could pay off. I've seen long shots win, but the exposure to risk is catastrophic. You have no diversification. You have no hedge. You've left no margin for error. In this instance, that risk is now crystallizing. Johnson's whole political viability was pegged to a single relationship, and that relationship is now showing clear signs of fracture. That is an incredibly vulnerable position to be in. My purpose here isn't to choose a political team. I've known good, honest people on both sides of the aisle. My purpose is to discuss the consequences of leadership failure. When institutions cease to operate as designed, because that breakdown affects every one of us, regardless of our affiliation. Johnson's refusal to negotiate, as I understand it, isn't rooted in a strategy for a better outcome. It's rooted in fear that deviating from the script will damage his standing with a particular base. Labeling negotiation as ransom might generate a good soundbite, but it is the antithesis of leadership. When all parties simply entrench themselves and assign blame, the resulting damage propagates. It reminds me of inflation. I certainly remember the 1970s. Once inflation takes root, it infects every part of the economy. Prices rise, savings evaporate. It contaminates the entire system. That is what we are seeing today, only the contagion is dysfunction. It metastasizes from one institution to the next, paralyzing the system. The government is shuttered. Federal workers aren't paid. Markets sense the instability. Even the president seems content with the gridlock, offering no path forward. I'm not privy to the private discussions, but the public posture suggests no urgency to find a solution. I've always said that inaction is an active choice, and right now, that choice is imposing a heavy cost on the country. In the corporate world, you do not manage a crisis by amplifying it. You don't refuse to engage. You find a resolution. You compromise. You protect the institution. I recall the 2008 financial crisis. immensely difficult decisions were required. People had to subordinate their pride and preferences to collaborate and prevent a total meltdown. It was messy, but it was necessary. The leaders who navigated that storm didn't do it by refusing to talk. A core rule I've lived by is to never concentrate your risk, especially when the asset is unpredictable. Johnson constructed his entire political existence around this single relationship. He neglected to build bridges across the aisle or to moderates within his own party. He made an unhedged, all-in bet on Trump. Now he's discovering the consequence of a one-sided relationship where loyalty is not returned. Trump has publicly attacked his shutdown approach and even labeled his budget ideas reckless. I do not use that term lightly. In my world, reckless means exposing the enterprise to unacceptable risk for no commensurate gain. It is a grave charge. Coming from the very person Johnson had aligned himself with, it's not a mere disagreement. It's a complete wipeout of political capital. This sends a chilling message to every Republican. Your devotion is not an insurance policy. The moment your perceived utility declines, you cease to be an asset and become a liability. When a CEO treats loyal managers as disposable, it tells you everything about the company's culture. It signals that loyalty is not a long-term asset. It's a short-term commodity. The operating principle becomes, what is your value to me today? When that happens, the most talented people head for the exits, or they shift their focus from protecting the company to protecting themselves. You get a culture dominated by CYA, cover your rear end. This is precisely what I see in Washington. There is more energy spent on political survival than on governing. The concern is about the optics on Fox News or MSNBC, not about the solution to the problem. That is a blueprint for organizational failure. Trump's move to discard one of his most consistent supporters isn't just personal. It's institutional. It communicates to every other Republican that allegiance is not a fixed return bond. It is a highly speculative option. You can vote with him 100% of the time, defend him in every crisis, and sacrifice public trust on his behalf. But if your political value drops, your position is liquidated. No warning, no golden parachute. Just gone. That signal propagates instantly. Capitol Hill is now, I suspect, full of legislators realizing their careers are dependent on an individual with no durable allegiances. That is a deeply unsettling realization. It is precisely like working for a firm where the CEO terminates people erratically, where security is non-existent, and where today's star performer is tomorrow's scapegoat. I've seen those companies. They don't last. Why? Because the actual talent flees. You are left with only two types of people: those who cannot find work elsewhere, or those who excel at internal politics but are incompetent at the actual job. Have witnessed this exact dynamic in the corporate world. When a dominant leader treats people as expendable, it fosters a toxic culture. Employees stop thinking about the organization's long-term health and focus only on their own survival. They stop taking intelligent risks. They stop raising red flags. They just try to stay out of the blast radius. When that shift occurs, the company stops innovating and eventually fails. I recall a company in the 1980s. I won't name it, run by a brilliant but tyrannical CEO. He was charismatic and a great salesman, but he had zero tolerance for dissent. So what happened? Every smart, independent thinker who would push back, who would say, "Wait, I see a flaw here," was either fired or left. He was left with a room full of sycophants. Within a few years, that company, absent any internal checks, made a series of catastrophic blunders that led it straight into bankruptcy. No one was willing to tell the emperor he was making a mistake. That is the peril of this leadership style. The damage isn't just to one person. It's the corrosion of the entire organization's effectiveness. Concurrently, we've seen notable protests nationwide, with people mobilizing over concerns about accountability. I am not going to debate the specific attendance figures. Those are always contentious. The precise tally is not the important data point. The signal is that when a large segment of the population feels the system is failing them, it demands attention. In markets, we analyze what people do with their money, not just what they say. When capital flees a specific sector, it tells you something is wrong. The same logic holds true here. When citizens are agitated enough to physically demonstrate, it signals a depth of concern that should not be dismissed. In an economy, a monopoly warps the free market. In a democracy, concentrated, unchecked power warps the political process. There has also been a lot of noise around social media posts. I will state this as a governing principle. When leadership relies on shock value rather than substantive policy, the institutions they lead are weakened. If a CEO I hired spent all his time generating online controversy instead of running the company, the board would have serious questions. Trust is accumulated over decades and vaporized in an instant. I have spent a lifetime building Berkshire Hathaway's reputation. That reputation is our most valuable asset, but it could be annihilated by one bad act. Right now, a tremendous amount of trust is being rapidly depleted in Washington. When institutions lose credibility, the cost is immeasurable. Let's review the context, because it's important. Mike Johnson assumed the speakership in late 2023, following Kevin McCarthy's removal. McCarthy was ousted, recall, after he made what appeared to be a pragmatic choice. He cut a deal to keep the government open. That single action, which was responsible from a governance perspective, was treated as a fireable offense by the most rigid ideological bloc within his party. Think about the signal that sends. It communicates that practical problem-solving is punished. It says that preventing a crisis is subordinate to ideological purity. When any organization begins to penalize compromise and reward confrontation, it ceases to be in the business of governance. It is in the business of theater. And as we know in the market, trauma doesn't create long-term value. Execution does. Johnson, learning from this, presented himself as the antidote, 100% loyal to Trump. To some, this was conviction. To me, it was a high-risk strategy with zero diversification. He made an all-in bet on a single relationship. He was operating, in financial terms, with extreme leverage. High potential upside, but a dangerously thin margin of safety. And when your entire political viability rests on the approval of one person, any disagreement becomes an existential crisis. The protracted government funding stalemate is the impossible situation this creates. Soldiers aren't getting paid. Federal functions are stalled. This is all over a spending bill, an issue that requires negotiation, not brinkmanship. I've been in countless negotiations. The best ones are where both parties walk away feeling they got something. Johnson's job should be to provide stability. But instead of leading, he has become a symbol of indecision. This is the outcome when influence is over-leveraged and leadership is absent. In the business world, failing to make payroll is a 5-alarm fire. In Washington, accountability is being avoided, as if the tangible consequences are imaginary. But federal workers are enduring real financial hardship. They are the collateral damage. That is not acceptable. It was reported that Johnson, under pressure, briefly floated the idea of bipartisan cooperation. It briefly appeared that responsible governance might prevail. But in a system that prioritizes loyalty tests over tangible results, any independent action is framed as betrayal. I am not speculating. I am observing a public pattern. We saw it with Jeff Sessions, fired for following DOJ guidelines. We saw it with Bill Barr, who lost favor for stating facts. We saw it with Mike Pence, abandoned for following the Constitution. This is a pattern where total loyalty is demanded, but never returned. In corporate governance, if executives are terminated for following the rules, it's a massive red flag. It signals the organization values compliance over competence. Kevin McCarthy walked this exact path. Total alignment. The instant he compromised to prevent a national crisis, his support vanished. He was sacrificed. Johnson is now caught in the same mechanism. When I analyze this pattern, I see an organizational design that actively punishes adaptation and rewards only rigid submission. In the corporate world, the companies that thrive are the ones that adapt. The companies that go to zero are the ones that cling to a failing plan out of pure rigidity. Any healthy organization requires people willing to tell you the truth. It needs systems that measure actual results, not just fealty. What I am witnessing in Washington is the precise inverse of that. Decisions are being driven by a fear of punishment rather than by a hope of achievement. That is not a sustainable model. In the long run, organizations that run on fear always, eventually, fail. Johnson has drawn sharp criticism from within his own party. When the most severe attacks are internal, it signals a deep structural flaw. I've seen this in toxic company cultures. Factions develop. People abandon shared goals. The operating question shifts from how do we win to how do I protect myself. Performance is the inevitable casualty. The predicament Johnson faces is an impossible calculation. To retain Trump's support, he must prolong the shutdown. In business, that's reputational suicide. Conversely, if he performs the actual duties of his office negotiating, governing, he is guaranteed to incite a revolt. That is the snare. His allegiance is not being measured by his effectiveness, but by his absolute compliance. It's a framework where competent governance is punished. I recall a company I was evaluating. On paper, it looked fantastic. But the employees all said, "We spend more time navigating internal rivalries than managing the business." I passed. And that company's performance fell off a cliff. In investing, we have a term for this: key man risk. It's the vulnerability you have when your entire enterprise hinges on one single individual. Prudent investors diversify to mitigate this precise exposure. Yet the Republican Party, in its current iteration, appears to have concentrated all its risk in one individual. This is not a political commentary. It is a risk management observation. And from that perspective, it is profoundly unstable. What I am observing is the consequence of an organization that has failed to diversify its leadership. When a single individual holds the power to retract support arbitrarily, it introduces systemic volatility. No one feels safe. Everyone defaults to a defensive posture. When an entire organization is on defense, innovation ceases, and the institution begins to decay from within. The downstream effect is visible: rising anxiety. If an individual as loyal as Johnson can be publicly undermined, then no one is secure. That uncertainty paralyzes an organization. I've managed Berkshire for decades, and I know you must keep your people focused outward on customers and opportunities. You never want them focused inward, worrying about how to please the boss. When that inward focus takes over, the organization is no longer effective. People ask me for a prediction. I don't make them. But I can tell you what history shows happens in these situations. When a culture becomes this toxic, you tend to see three outcomes. First, constant churn. People try to navigate the impossible, fail, and are pushed out. The cycle repeats. Second, a degradation of talent. When the metric for success is compliance, not competence, you stop attracting leaders. Third, escalating dysfunction that eventually forces a correction. Sometimes it's external, an election. Sometimes it's internal, a total collapse. But systems built on unsustainable foundations always fail. The only variable is the amount of collateral damage incurred. My deepest concern isn't any single politician. It is the systemic erosion of institutional norms, which are the reputational capital of a country. These assets, public trust, legitimacy, stability, are worth more than any balance sheet. When they are depleted, they cannot be quickly replenished. I'm 94 years old. This era feels different, not because the challenges are greater, but because the institutional guardrails feel so much weaker. Think of driving on a mountain pass. The guardrails aren't there to impede you. They are there to prevent a catastrophe. When they are rusted or missing, one small error can be fatal. That is an accurate description of our institutional landscape today. My skill, if I have one, is differentiating signal from noise. Washington is producing a deafening amount of noise. But the signal I am receiving is one of profound institutional weakness. When you design a system around the whims of one person, rather than around durable principles, you are building on sand. It might stand for a while, but when the storm comes, and a storm always comes, the entire structure is vulnerable. Now, systems are capable of self-correction, but correction requires acknowledging the problem. I am not seeing much of that. I see people trying to survive rather than trying to lead. I understand it. When the environment punishes leadership, rational people become risk-averse. But when everyone becomes risk-averse, the problems don't vanish. They compound. The shutdown is that compounding problem. The costs are real, but solving it requires someone to take a career-ending risk. That is the very definition of a broken system. When the price of doing the right thing exceeds the price of doing nothing, you have engineered incentives that guarantee failure. The irony is that those responsible for this likely see it as strength. But there is a vast difference between being principled and being rigid. I am principled about integrity. I am flexible about almost everything else. That flexibility has been central to Berkshire's success. This situation has made practical problem-solving impossible because every issue is escalated into a test of loyalty. And the heavy cost of that impossibility falls on ordinary people. In investing, you worry when everyone else is focused on short-term wins. My worry isn't about policy. It's about the system itself breaking. What's not normal is watching the basic functions of government stop. Trust is fragile. Stability requires maintenance. I don't have easy answers, but I am certain of this. The current path is unsustainable. Something must change. My hope is that we don't wait for a catastrophic break, because gradual reform is always superior to a sudden collapse. But reform requires acknowledging the problem. And as I've always said, bad news doesn't get better with time. The problems are visible, but they are not being addressed. It is a vicious cycle. I'll end with this. In investing, the most dangerous trap is believing the rules no longer apply to you. I see a great deal of that pride in Washington today. But the rules do exist for a reason. Institutions matter. Norms matter. They are all that stand between us and chaos. I cannot predict how this chapter ends. What I do know is that the underlying structural weakness, the institutional decay, is not solved by one person. That requires sustained reform. The pattern I see is deeply troubling. If I saw this pattern in a company, I wouldn't just walk away, I would run. This isn't about Republican or Democrat. It's about whether we have a system that can function. On that measure, I am very concerned. But I am also hopeful, because I have seen this country overcome far greater challenges. We just need to find the courage to face this one. Thank you.